So good afternoon. My name is Anita Barstow. I'm a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Tulsa. And this is the American burying beetle. It's a federally listed endangered species. Currently, we have 4 conservation banks for this critter in Oklahoma. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the conservation banking and what it's all about and why you should care about it. Hey. Although my experience is mainly with the conservation banking for listed species, I'll touch on other current markets and future markets, environmental markets, all those things. So you might ask, click. Is this our clicker? Yes. Okay, so you might ask, what are environmental markets? So environmental markets are a voluntary means to reduce the cost of compliance with environmental regulations, and they're also a tool to create incentives for better resource management. So you're likely aware that ecosystem services that benefit society are provided by forests, grasslands, rivers, streams, and other animals. These benefits include air and water quality and quantity improvements. It also improves flood control, carbon sequestration, and nutrient regulation. Currently, the California Air Resources Board developed a regulated carbon market to offset greenhouse gases releases. This is your cap and trade market. It would be considered a compliance market, meaning you do not have a choice to comply. So there we go. So environmental markets can provide environmental benefits. They can reduce the cost of restoration compliance, increase opportunities for investments. They can expand revenues for working lands and accelerate conservation activities, and also improve accountability and effectiveness of existing conservation programs. So species conservation markets are both federal and state listed flora and fauna species can benefit from a environmental market structure. These currently include conservation banking for listed species, which is regulated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then on the coastal areas by National Marine Fisheries Service. We have also mitigation banking for wetlands and streams. This is regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And then there are in lieu fees that can be tied to either a 404 market or a species market. Large projects sometimes would create their own individual in lieu fee fund. This is what Enbridge Partners did with their Flanagan South Pipeline project that helped RSU fund their research station. In lieu fees are also different from other federal funds because they're not considered federal funds. They're actually private funds that can be combined with other federal funding from, say, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Service program or the NRCS programs for landowners. So to give you an idea of how many conservation banks and mitigation banks and in lieu fee sites are around the nation, here's a nice graphic from the RIBITS database that shows you that tracks all of the current mitigation 404 banks, wetland streams, species, and in lieu fee sites. You can see there's quite a few around the nation. One thing I'd like to mention is also RIBITS does have a public-facing site where developers can actually search for their available credits for whichever resource they may be impacting in the area of concern. So the purposes of the Endangered Species Act are to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which threatened and endangered species depend may be conserved, and to provide a program for the conservation of listed species and to take steps to achieve their recovery. This is all lined out in Section 2B of the Act. And the ESA also directs all other federal agencies beside the conservation organizations to utilize their authorities to carry out programs to further the conservation of listed species. So Section 7 and Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act require impacts to endangered species to either be avoided or minimized and compensated for. It also provides a mechanism for offsetting and compensating for these impacts. The requirements in Section 7, which are consultations with other federal agencies, provide an incidental take statement. And then Section 10, habitat conservation plans are for private actions and provide incidental take permits. So these are the mechanisms from which the conservation banking was born. It's the regulatory framework that creates the market forces that support the conservation banking industry. Even though we would all love for it to be true, without a regulatory framework to compel a developer to offset their impacts, the simple fact is, not many will. Nor will they make conservation investments out of the goodness of their hearts. So the regulatory structure is that the agencies create the framework through the various environmental laws, such as the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act, among others. When construction happens, the regulations require offsets to those impacts that cannot be otherwise avoided. And then the developer then purchases bank credits from a conservation bank or a mitigation bank, depending on which resource is being affected. But it is worth noting that many regulatory agencies prefer developers use bank credits to offset their impacts. The Corps actually wrote into their 2008 mitigation rule the preference for mitigation banks. So banks first, then in lieu fees, and then permittee responsible mitigation is how their hierarchy works. So through the regulatory framework established in the Act, there are some basic types of compensatory mitigation for impacts to resources. While not the only way to offset for an impact or compensate for the impacts, the main players include compensatory mitigation types or permittee responsible mitigation. This is where the project proponent, the one who's doing the impacting, actually finds a piece of land that's close by the impacts, and then they develop their own offsets, they manage it, they fund it, they manage all in perpetuity. Most of them don't like to do this. That's probably the least restrictive offset. The next one in line is third-party mitigation. These are in lieu fees would fall into this category. This is where the project proponent will actually pay someone else to do their mitigation. So when they transfer that mitigation to a third-party mitigation provider, then that mitigation provider assumes all the liability for the success of that mitigation property. With the banking option, project proponents just go to the bank, ask for how many credits they need, pay for their credits, and move on. So it's very easy, it's quick for them, it's quick for us, it's quick, the conservation has already been developed. So it's pretty much a win-win for both people. Banking also has a really good relationship to species recovery because conservation banks and mitigation lands are dedicated to species management. All the conservation bank areas will be protected by a conservation easement. They'll have a long-term management plan to manage for that resource specifically, and then they'll also have a perpetual stewardship endowment that will fund those activities in perpetuity. So they'll put an amount of money into a fund, and the proceeds from that fund are what is to manage the property. Banks, because of these perpetual protections, help to demonstrate secure populations for recovery and then ultimately provide support for any status reviews. So from an agency perspective, we like conservation banks because credits are available right now. We don't have to negotiate with the developer over the compensatory mitigation of the project. How much do you need? What is it going to look like? We don't have to do all that because the bank's already done that for them. It also assures conservation of the species before the impacts occur. Now, this is important because there's no lag time between those impacts for the species and the restoration. So when you have an endangered species, if you have part of that habitat that's already limited, taken out of production, and you have to wait a period of time for that to come back online, then you're losing part of that recovery potential for the species. So also, banks are durable. They use a conservation easement. They have a bank enabling instrument that controls all aspects of what they do. And then they have a secure funding to manage the property in perpetuity. Developers also prefer banks because it reduces their permitting timelines, and because for developers, time is money. And the quicker you can get them their permit, the quicker they can move forward and the less money they're going to have to spend. So this allows them to proceed with their projects quicker. There's no ongoing maintenance or reporting requirements, and it transfers all the liability, like I said earlier, for the success of the mitigation to the bank sponsor. The developer just pays the credits and walks away. So that's why they like it so much. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 4 operational mitigation banks in Oklahoma. We have the Muddy Boggy Conservation Bank and the American Bearing Beetle Conservation Bank. These 2 were the first 2 established in Oklahoma. Since they were established, they've been lands have been added to them pretty much every year. They started out with about 700 acres, 1,600 acres, right at there and there. They're both about, close to 5, 4.5, 5. Then the Dirty Creek and Catcher Ranch has come online here in the last year and a half or so. Together, since 2012, we've got a total of over 12,000 acres on the ground under a bank. Now, this doesn't include other compensatory mitigation like that comes from, say, an in lieu fee fund or a permittee responsible mitigation. We have a lot of that on the ground as well. So what kind of requirements are needed to create a conservation bank? Well, that question is completely species dependent. So but one critical aspect is site selection. You want to make sure that you have a good site for your conservation bank. But they also must plan, fund, and execute all of the activities in perpetuity. So they'll have to establish that third-party conservation easement and a third-party endowment holder and that endowment. Additionally, they must plan for adaptive management and any unforeseen events. So if they have a tornado or something they weren't planning on that happens to the bank, they have the ability to restore that and get those credits back from that area. It requires regular habitat maintenance is a must, and for almost all species. And the beetle is no exception. And then banks must also provide annual reports to the regulatory agencies that are their controllers. I think I missed one. Oh, I see. Sorry, I missed one. So to recap, what are some of the things to consider if wanting to develop a conservation bank? So first, we'll have the bank sponsor controls the price of those credits. So there is dependent on them. The services or the regulators have no dog in the fight of how much they charge for a credit. It's totally market dependent. Requires a stewardship endowment. The endowment can be funded through the credit sales, or it can be funded upfront or periodically throughout the process. It can provide a good revenue source for both the bank owner and the landowner and the bank sponsor. Protects species in perpetuity through a conservation easement, helps recover the species, and then also, to boot, low impact, non-consumptive recreation such as hunting or fishing are many times compatible. Recreational activities are allowed and encouraged as long as they don't reduce the conservation value in the bank. What's going on? Is that going slow? Okay, there we go. All right, so conservation banks can help struggling family farms to keep their livelihoods. So this is kind of a bonus. Many farming families are land rich but cash poor. So there are alternative sources of income that allows them to keep their land, but also makes some additional money to help all of the species and everybody involved. So it's a good win-win for both people. So here's how it works. Once the bank sponsor sells all the credits in their bank, the bank is then closed, and all that's left is the conservation on the property. The conservation easement stays, the stewardship endowment stays, and then the management plan also continues on in perpetuity. So the landowner can, if he wants to continue on in that capacity, can actually make sure that they've got everything they need. Which leads us into Site-specific considerations. So when you're looking at a property, siting is important, but also within that site, you're going to need to look at things like split estates. Are the water or the air or the minerals separated from that surface right? And those are additional things hurdles that you have to work through. Are there any title issues? Are there any liens on the property you're wanting to put a bank on? That's important. We need to look at previous land uses. What's been going on that land? Is it suitable to restore, or are there animals on it now? Are there contaminants on the site? Neighboring land uses. So site-specific considerations, all of these things would be considered when looking at a bank property. Anticipated land use changes nearby could undermine the conservation utility of a proposed bank site, such as if the land nearby was slated for development, then it's going to really encroach on that ecology of that site. Careful site selection could, though, locate a bank in a place where it could provide replacement habitat for habitat nearby that may become unsuitable due to some sort of no management or succession. So that would be also something you could look at. Also, one would want to look at the type of management that's needed. Will there be a need for a prescribed fire? Are there communities right next door downwind that would be problematic if they had smoke? So these are the kinds of things that you have to look at when you're looking at a site selection. And then lastly, we have the fee schedule. The fee schedule is the amount the bank sponsor charges the developer for a credit. So I hear a lot of times developers complain or lamenting about the high cost of these credits for the beetle credits. And when you consider everything that goes into a bank, it's not hard to see why they cost what they cost, because you have to put all of those securities, all of those assurances in place. The regulatory agencies have no part in the fee schedule, like I said earlier. This program operates totally within the free market. So the market forces, it's supply and demand. If there's very little credits in the marketplace, they're going to charge more for them. If there's a whole bunch of them, they're not going to charge as much. So regulatory agencies' role is to review the bank sponsor's stewardship endowment and their rate of return to make sure that it's adequate to be able to fund the management in perpetuity, but that the actual costs of the credits are determined by the bank sponsor. So let's look at what goes into the price of a conservation mitigation credit. I've talked about several of the components, but I'm going to kind of boil it down to the nuts and bolts here for you. The expected costs are associated with restoration, establishment, enhancement, and preservation of a property. That's pretty obvious. But what they also need to consider is contingency funds, taking into account risks and uncertainties. But more specifically, the cost of a credit has to reflect the land acquisition, project planning and design, construction, plant materials, and labor. Needs to consider long-term management and protection of the bank site, any financial assurances that may be necessary to ensure successful completion of any improvement or creation habitat projects within the bank. And then it has to continue monitoring, and then also remediation, adaptive management, and of course, legal fees. So I've provided quite a bit of information for you right here, and with the plethora of information, does anybody have any questions at all?
You guys have any questions here? Does anybody have questions online? I have one person who's been watching on Instagram full time. Any questions on Instagram? Facebook? So, go ahead.
Sure.
So what would be the range of the cost of these credits? Since they say they're pricey, do you have the idea of the cost per credit?
Well, yeah, it's really market forces. I've seen credits go from, let's say, when we first started the beetle banking, I think credits were going for about $6,000 to $8,000 a credit. One credit is equal to 1 acre usually, but it doesn't have to. It just depends on the bank and how they want to, between the banks and the regulatory agencies, how those split out nicely. I know fairy shrimp, like if you have a vernal pool in California, a fairy shrimp credit will cost you close to $1 million. So it depends on how threatened or endangered the species is. Where is the available lands for that species? How much are those available lands? What does it take to manage for the species? There's a whole plethora of reasons why a credit could be cheap or expensive. So, but thank you for that question.
So, kind of explain to us, you can go back to what the importance of creating these banks, so like what is the importance overall to conservation?
So I would say the overall importance to conservation for conservation banks is that it provides secure areas that then will never be impacted or they could be impacted, but they'll always be protected, they'll always be managed. Then they'll also actually put in resources to improve the conservation of the species, to put it more towards recovery. So we can actually benefit the species a little bit more with those secure populations. And then also, with the conservation bank, because it's a free enterprise, there's a lot of people with interests in the success of the bank. So it's not just one person out there saying, "Oh, is this going to work?" You have a lot of people with vested interests in whether those conservation banks actually succeed. So it's a pretty good dog.
So can you tell us about your experience with the RSU one, with the beetle?
Well, I remember. So I worked on the Enbridge Flanagan pipeline project, where this pipeline was a pipeline that went from Flanagan, Illinois to Cushing, Oklahoma. So Oklahoma had just a little bit of that pipeline. But because we had a conservation strategy and offsets and mitigation already lined out, they just took that and said, okay, so within Oklahoma, wherever the beetle occurred, and they did surveys to see if it was there or not, wherever they needed to offset for wherever the species was, they put it into an in lieu fee fund and gave it, and that is being held by the Conservation Fund, which is a national 501c3. So through them, we were to identify various projects within close proximity to the pipeline. Eastern Oklahoma, northern eastern Oklahoma were close enough to get us there, right? There's other projects that we did help fund in southern Oklahoma, but we didn't fund those completely. It was just a little bit of a funding because it's farther away, so we kind of dropped that mitigation. But when they put the conservation fund in, they asked where your project. They told me about a project they were doing in Kansas with a university. I think the Boy Scouts were involved. The state was involved. This was like a great big thing. I'm like, seems like I remember Rogers State needing a research station because I don't think they have one. So let me see if they'd be interested. So I walked over to the science programs and I let them know I had a little bit of mitigation funding, and they're like, okay, great. I'm like, so maybe I'll come back and talk to them again. And so I come back and they said, well, how much are we talking about? I said, I don't know. Could you use $1 million? and that was the best day of my life, to watch the reactions, to say, wow, we thought, a little bit of funds was a little bit of funds, but this was more than a little. So that was probably the highlight in my career, to be able to help a university produce a research station that would totally benefit the species, the students, the area, everything. So it was just a jewel for me. So that was probably one of the best things I've ever done.
Great.
Thanks.
Cool. Somebody else have any questions before we go? Somebody online? Okay. Good to go.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been wonderful.